Hey everyone, so this video is not one of my normal videos. This is kind of about politics, but also, this one is about something that's going on here in Istanbul and and around the country here in Turkey, but is about, it's about something where Americans may see it on TV and might not understand what it is. And so, let's just get into it. So basically, there is this university called Bogazici, and I think I'm mostly saying that correctly, though my Turkish is non-existent. Bogazici is known as one of the really premier universities here in Turkey. And it's really well known. Actually, there's a whole bunch of teachers who I work with who have gotten their degrees from Bogazici. So it's well known here. And basically, stop, Janet. This kind of goes back to 2016, or the time after the coup. So basically, the leadership here believes that the person who orchestrated the coup was a guy named Gulen, Fethullah Gulen. And actually, he lives in the U.S. He lives in Pennsylvania in the Poconos. And he's kind of in exile, kind of self-imposed exile. I don't think that he's that he's like a political asylum seeker, but I'm not sure. He may have filed for that. I think he's just a resident of the U.S., like a green card holder. At any rate, the leadership here believes that he fomented the coup that happened a couple years ago, and he owned or controlled a whole bunch of universities and hospitals. And so what happened after the coup is there was a change in leadership in a whole ton of universities and hospitals. There were a bunch of people who were jailed, a bunch of people who were tried. There are people who were blacklisted so they can't get certain jobs or can't get a job at all. There were people who, basically a whole bunch of universities and hospitals were kind of put under government supervision, we'll say. And then it was sorted out somehow later on, but because of this guy. Now, as for whether or not this guy did it, I have no idea. But that's what the leadership here believes. And the U.S. has an extradition treaty with Turkey, to my understanding. The problem is that the evidence that Turkey has submitted to the U.S. In order to get this guy extradited and brought over here for a trial has not met the U.S. standards for extradition, apparently. And so the U.S. won't play ball. And that kind of feeds into the leadership's argument here that, oh, foreign countries are meddling with our sovereignty and so on. And that's actually something that they're saying about this right here as well. And so basically, around that time, there was a state of emergency. And after that, there was a new vote where the president was given a whole bunch of extra powers, essentially kind of like state of emergency powers, but for all the time, just from that point on. And that's not a great way of explaining it. There's a lot more detail to it, but you can think of it like that for the purposes of this. And one of those powers was that the government can change the administration of any school anytime. And that was what happened here at Bogazici University. They brought in, the government decided that rather than having the students elect the rector of the university, which is what would normally happen there apparently, they didn't want that process to occur. Instead, they just basically put this person in here, and I think his name is Melibulu, I think. Let me see. Let me find it. Yeah, Melibulu. And now this here, this Birgun website was translated, but some of the translation isn't great, so you'll just have to bear with me on this. So Melibulu must resign is the thing that they're saying there. And then when we come here, Bogazici rector Melibulu says he will not resign. This here is a letter from Bogazici's students to the president of Turkey, and it hits on a whole lot of things. So let me try and get to some of like the meat of it. So it says, up until today, you've demanded secret meetings with us, the Turkish youth, and Education Service Foundation. Now you're trying to start an argument through the media. We don't like go-betweens. We prefer speaking outright and explicitly to all. We hope that you will proceed accordingly. So that's kind of a slight to the administration, where it seems like the administration was maybe trying to do something in the background without media attention. But, you know, the students, it didn't work out one way or another. And so the students have sent this out to, of course, sent it to the administration, but also sent it to the media. Let's see. You appointed a rector to a university with disregard for the students and faculty. It was legal, yes, but illegitimate is what the students are saying. This is what all of these protests have been about that have been happening around Istanbul and in other cities in Turkey. And just as sort of an aside, you should know that the freedom of speech doesn't exist here in Turkey the way it does in the US. So in the US, the freedom of speech was made right off the bat primarily for political speech. And actually there are more freedoms afforded to Americans for political speech, which, as you've seen in the news recently, like with this Trump stuff, makes it more difficult to prosecute or sue a person over political speech than it would over normal speech, even if it's inflammatory or whatever. And of course, violence is a different thing. If it's inciting violence, as you've seen on the American news, then that's not protected speech. But essentially everything else is. Here, there are laws where essentially criticizing the government is illegal. So while in the U.S., free speech was made specifically for political reasons, for political speech, in other places, like here, the opposite is true. So, you know, for Americans, it's nice to be able to call your neighbor a jackass, but the reason for it is I can say Trump was the worst president that's ever existed. I wish COVID had taken him, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. You know what I mean? Because it's not inciting violence in any way. Something like that could get a person in trouble here if they were to, you know, speak about Turkish administration in that same way. So free speech doesn't exist. But one of the other things that doesn't exist, or at least to my understanding, from what I've seen, is there are not limits on there are not the same limits, term limits on government, people who are elected here in the government, like the president, like there are in the U.S. So in the U.S., I'm sure pretty much everybody here knows, like for instance, when FDR was the president back in the 30s and into World War II, he was into serving his fourth term when he died, and Harry Truman took over. But now, as Americans know, you can only serve 2 terms. So like Obama had 8 years, Trump only had 4, because he was a terrible president. But here, that same thing doesn't exist. And so Erdogan's been in power for something like 16 or 20 years, 16 or 18 years, something like that, with his leading party. Now, those terms might exist, but apparently, if that's the case, there are ways of getting around it, maybe? I'm not totally sure of the details on that. But it's not the same like it is in the U.S. You know, in the U.S., you get 2 terms, that's a hard limit. And the only possible exception is if in the U.S. a person is vice president, that president fails to be able to be president any longer, and the vice president takes over for the remainder of their term. I believe that person then still can serve 2 complete terms as president, effectively giving them 2+, like you know, less than 3, we'll say. But as far as I know, that's the only case where in American politics, a president can serve more than 2 terms. Here, whatever the details are, that essentially doesn't exist. And so this guy's been in power for this long. So those are just a couple of things to you know, keep in mind. And again, that theme of foreign interference plays into a bunch of this. So I'm not sure if it's in this particular article, but one of the things that the folks in power allude to is, oh, these students aren't really upset about this. They're actors, basically, and or not that they're actors. They're being played by foreign influencers. That foreigners are trying to make this into a bigger deal, and that's something that's a constant sort of trope in Turkish politics, that there's this existential fear that their sovereignty is being, thwarted in some way. And don't get me wrong, the U.S. meddles in other elections. Russia clearly does, and in other political spheres, political issues. But I can't speak for Russia, but I think when the U.S. does it, they're more like snipers rather than shotgunners. What I mean is, they're not just going to try and meddle in all of politics. They're going to choose something that's a high value issue, and that's what they would meddle in. This isn't really a high value issue. One rector at one university, and really even the idea of it isn't a huge high value issue. If it was, the U.S. probably would have tried to deal with it closer to, the coup when we were in a state of emergency here, or after the vote which gave the president these extra powers. I don't think that America would see this, and I don't know that America was specifically singled out, or if it was just foreign powers, but I don't think America would see this issue as warranting the type of action that would be required, because there's such it's a high risk, low benefit type of situation, really. And there have been lots of protests here about lots of things. One of them is LGBT plus rights, and that comes into this as well. And so let's see. You open faculties and appoint deans with an overnight presidential order on Friday to intimidate the whole institution, is what the students are claiming. Again, this is to the current administration, to the politicians in power. Your attempts to pack our university with your own political militants is a symptom of the political crisis that you've fallen into. And what they're kind of saying there is, they're saying that they're packing universities unnecessarily, and of course with people who are sympathetic to the administration. What they're saying is kind of like what Trump did with the Supreme Court, where Trump in the U.S. packed the Supreme Court with conservative judges to make a supermajority, to make it 6-3. But in this case, they're saying a symptom of the political crisis that you've fallen into. I'm not sure exactly that, and that part of that might be the translation too. But it seems like what they're saying is, you've been able to do this since the coup happened, and are doing it now. Victims of your crisis grow in number with every day. Let's see. They're saying we use our constitutional rights to make people from all segments of society aware of the injustices we are subjected to. Part of the problem there is a big chunk of the electorate who is conservative and ultra-conservative here, who frankly doesn't care and is diehard for the conservative wing, the two main parties who are in a political coalition, and don't care. But also, they say we use our constitutional rights, and honestly, again, as an American, the way that we view constitutional rights, they don't necessarily have the constitutional rights that they're claiming, and that's kind of an interesting point here. It should really probably say we use the constitutional rights that we used to have, or that we would like to have, or something like that. What's interesting about this too is the leadership just recently talked about changing the Constitution, or by the sounds of the articles I read, throwing it out and creating a new one, essentially. I don't know if that's translation is accurate though. And I don't know all the details of that, but it sounded like part of the idea was to make some humanitarian reforms to make Western society, Europe, America, Canada, I guess, Western society, believe that politics here are being reformed in a positive way. And so the other thing too is the Constitution, I think, I don't know, it kind of seems like, it kind of feels like, although people are passionate about it, it feels like it holds less weight than it does in the U.S., where in the U.S. people feel so strongly about it that, I mean, people forget that amendments even occur in the U.S. because they happen so rarely. And in this case, they're talking about a huge undertaking of really rewriting the whole thing by the sounds of it. That would be absurd in American politics. That would be absolutely unheard of. And, you know, we say what we can have our opinions in American politics about how other countries are run, but the fact is the U.S. is 250 years old or so. This country, I think their revolution was in 1923 when they finally became independent, but you should realize that people have been living here. This city specifically has existed for about 8,000 years. So they've tried a lot of different shit and have a decent idea of stuff that's worked well, stuff that hasn't, considering cultural norms and values and morals and ethics and things like that as well. And so I think in the West, we oftentimes look at countries like Turkey as though they're immature or lesser developed. And they're really not. They've just developed in a different way because of a different culture. And, you know, still, there are issues, of course, in particular the economy right now, and unemployment are two big ones. And so, so there are differences. Anyways. So the students are saying that these folks need to resign. In universities, democratic rectorate elections must be held with the participation of all constituents of the university. And that's their main argument. It's a constitutional right to call for the resignation of the president, ? Yes. And that's where they're questioning their own constitutional right, because again, in the US it would be. Here, it may be considered insulting to do so, in which case people could be arrested and you know, have a trial and imprisoned and so on because of it. Since when is the use of a constitutional right a matter of courage? And they say here, this is the main point of this. Don't mistake us for those who obey you unconditionally. You are not a sultan and we are not your subjects. Let's see. Yeah, I believe that the person specifically they're talking to, Erdogan, has been in power for 19 years. But I think that power has changed over time. And again, the powers that his position holds have changed as well. And specifically after the coup, after the state of emergency was lifted, they changed quite a bit. And that's where you hear about the executive here consolidating power, which happens in most countries after an incident occurs. And that's not a uniquely Turkish thing either. I mean, if you think about what happened in the US after 9/11, George Bush, in a way, consolidated power with the Patriot Act. I mean, that was essentially what that was. It was a major surveillance act, but it was a consolidation of power of the executive branch. I think that was voted on. I think it must have been as well. So not solely the executive branch, but of the government, you know, at large, we'll say. This is another sort of facet of it here, that they say the interior minister, I forget the interior minister's name, is spreading lies to play on religious sensitivity, and we say that we will not practice self-censorship. Religious sensitivities are another huge issue here. And, you know, something that's important to note is that in the next couple of years, a lot of people who are, you know, student age will become part of the voting electorate and don't tend to have the same or as deep religious sensitivities. So the administration's feeling some pressure right now by COVID, of course, the economy, unemployment, things like this as well. The Biden administration coming into play, and the idea that, of course, if we look back 5 or 6 years, it wasn't just the Trump administration and a more conservative movement. It was also Brexit and conservative leaders around the globe being brought in. This being a conservative group, they're feeling political pressure from lots of things like that. Sorry about the message there. Janet, of course, just had to hit my tablet. Anyways, let's see. They're talking about a couple of specific people here who they mention. Let's see. And then they go into these things are sort of some accusations or really some. Here they're talking about the resignation of the president himself, which isn't going to happen, and they're saying we're not asking you to do that. We would not consider calling for your resignation. We don't think that you will, essentially, or else you would have already. Let's see. But what they're saying is you have preferred to present yourself as naively deceived instead of, in your own words, having the guts, having the courage. So why would we bother to call on you to resign? Let's see. We stand with those who are robbed of their democratic rights and freedoms. And I think here they're talking not only about this specific issue, but they're talking about a bunch of other issues too. So again, LGBTQ issues. Did I say that right? I don't remember. LGBT plus issues, we'll say. So for instance, I think maybe the first year that I was here, which was the year before the coup, there was a pride parade, like a gay pride parade. And every year they tried to schedule one, they tried to have one, and every year the government says, you can't have one because it would be too insecure, and so for your own safety, we're not allowing this. And if it happens, we'll then arrest you folks taking part of it. That seems to be a cover for the fact that, again, sort of going back to those religious sensitivities. It also seems like the administration here, again, who's claiming to be heavily religious, is trying to move towards this country no longer being secular and being an Islamic-led state, which is, again, not unprecedented. I mean, right next door we have Iran, which is presumably an Islamic-led state as well. So that's not a wholly, that's not a strange thing. What's a bit strange in it is that typically it seems when societies move from religious-based into secular in terms of government, they don't tend to go back, with Iran being one notable exception in the Islamic Revolution of 1979. And don't get me wrong, in the Iranian Revolution, the Shah was a terrible, horrible leader. At the same time, the people there today seem to not approve, for the most part, of their government, of what the government's doing themselves anyways. So it's kind of like, hey, you got what you asked for, even if you didn't really like what you asked for, type of thing in the end. But of course, that's now, what was it? It was 1979, so that's whatever that is, 30 years on, 40 years on. 40 years on, and so it's possible at the beginning of that, the people really did want that and like it and appreciate it. But again, that was the people who made that change at that time to oust the Shah. In this case, it's the government trying to do that. It also seems too like there is an effort to take Ataturk, who is their George Washington. The George Washington of Turkey is Ataturk, and Ataturk means father of the Turks. His actual name was Mustafa Kemal, but Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. There seems to be a trend in the administration of trying to remove Ataturk from the history books in a way. And I don't say that lightly. For instance, there were two main airports here. One on this side, on the Asian side, the Anatolian side, and one on the European side. The one on the European side was Ataturk Airport. A third airport has been built. It doesn't have a name yet, but it is being used. While Ataturk Airport is now basically used for like UPS and FedEx and DHL and that type of thing. And so more or less the glory was taken out of the Ataturk Airport, and it's almost like it still has an identity, but it doesn't have the identity of being Istanbul's premier, largest, biggest, most important airport any longer. That's now this new, as of now, unnamed one. Let's see. Some 600 people have been detained since January 4th after the protests spread in Istanbul and Ankara. Most have been released, even though some officials are calling the protesters terrorists. And then this is another thing here too. There are claims by the administration here where they're saying to other countries. Before you talk to us about what we're doing to our citizens, arresting protesters and the free speech issue and stuff, look in the mirror, basically. But, and specifically in the U.S., they refer back to the riots, the terrorism of January 6th. But these are totally different. Firstly, there have been, I think, as of today, 240 arrests made or something like that in the U.S. Those are people who are trying to overthrow the government, not get a university dean changed, not get a university rector changed. They're completely different. Apart from that, there were 5 deaths, but I think only one of them was caused by the state. I don't know that that's happened here yet, thank God. I don't recall. But if these things continue on, it's possible. This is so it's a false equivalency, is my point, to try to say that these protests are equivalent to what happened in the U.S. on the 6th are absolutely false. But it brings up a good point. The paranoia here, a big part of the paranoia right now, is the same existential paranoia that existed during the Gezi Park protests of 2013. And they're concerned about the Arab Spring. They're concerned that there will be a Turkish Spring, more or less, where the people en masse protest to try to overthrow the government. And the sad thing about that is that these students are becoming more and more inspired and moving towards doing something like that simply because of a silly little thing like this that in terms of politics shouldn't be that important. I mean, there could at least be a dialogue. Maybe it could be where students are able to vote and then the government approves that rector or something like that. Why this one specific person is so important to the government for being in that university, I don't personally know. But what it seems like, what's been reported and what I've read and heard and so on, is this university is known to be one of the last sort of bastions of liberalism of the left. And I'm talking about Turkish liberalism, which is not the liberalism of the U.S. It's certainly, it's different, but considered to be a bastion of liberalism. So I don't even know that I have a good analog for that, but it would almost be like if conservatives, if conservatives in the U.S. tried to do the same thing. There's this conservative notion in the U.S. that university turns good God-fearing conservatives into leftist liberal gays or whatever, and which is bullshit to begin with. But it would be like if conservatives started to just flush out the leaders of universities and install conservative Christian, right or far right leaders. That's essentially what's going on here. And if that were to happen, rightly so, there would be protests in the U.S. as well. But I don't think that the U.S. administration would ever see that as being an important enough thing to even bother doing. I don't think they'd ever even try it if they truly thought that it was causing some sort of problem, some sort of scourge in the U.S. Like, if far-right folks in the U.S. were thinking that BLM came from universities or something, I don't even think that they would have the balls to try it because they know it would be hands down absolutely rejected by the people of the U.S., by the electorate, and so on. This other one is just a similar thing from about the same. So, let's see. Students started protesting about a month ago, saying that this was contrary to the customs from the last 158 years, which is huge. Let's see, Turkish police intervened. A lot of the students who were initially, detained were released as well. This part is concerning. They say that apparently there was video where students are saying that police told them after they had detained these students, I believe, look down. Don't keep your heads down. Don't even look up. And what the General Directorate of Security is now saying is, no, the police were saying walk down the street, not look down, walk down. In other words, saying that, our police don't act as though we're in a police state. They were just saying walk down. I haven't seen the video. I don't know anything about that, but that was something I thought was illustrative of what's going on now. And let's see. They're talking about the fake news. The fake news here, which is interesting because the state largely controls all of the news outlets here. Not completely, but to a much greater extent than it does in the U.S. Think of it this way. I think a good analog would be if Newsmax, OAN, and Fox were not just the conservative media, but the only media under Trump. Or now that we have Biden in office, if those were suddenly deemed terrorist propaganda or whatever and shut down completely, and if CNN and MSNBC and whatever were the only news media that's left, it's the freedom of the press here doesn't really exist in the same way it does in the U.S. either. And in particular after the coup, and these are some of the human rights violations that have been talked about in the UN, the European Union, the U.S. about Turkey, that after the coup specifically, journalists were targeted heavily, and political rivals of the AKP, of the party that's in power here. Let me see if there's anything else in this one that seems important. I thought that there was. So anyways, the point was just to give an idea to people in America or people in, English-speaking countries, what's going on when you see protests in the news. Hopefully this gives a kind of a better idea of some of the concerns. I may have gotten something wrong. If I did, you can yell at me in the comments. That's fine. Hopefully I don't get arrested. I'm not really a journalist anyways, but it's an interesting time here. Honestly, I think, in my opinion, the leadership is trying to give off the look of strength while doing these things that wouldn't be done by a strong administration. A strong administration wouldn't care about university rectors. It wouldn't even matter to them. They'd be more concerned about the economy and the virus and things like that. And sure, re-election is a part of that, but it seems like what's being done here is just being done to shore up election results in 2023, assuming a snap election doesn't happen, which it might. They do that in this country, where snap election can be called. And if that's the case, that is the least democratic thing that one can do. And that happens in the U.S. a whole bunch as well, but usually on a smaller scale. It's just sad. It's a sad thing when stuff like this happens, especially with students. These are, whether the conservatives are in power in 20 years or 30 years, or whether liberals are, whether they write a new constitution or not, whether universities even exist or not in 20 or 30 years, and whether this place is Islamic or secular, the folks who are in power now are going to be gone, and these students are going to be the ones in power. And not necessarily these specific students, but students in general. And it seems to me like the folks who are there, who are in power now, need to open their mind and let go of some of the things that they believe are getting them votes from the older, more conservative population, and they need to start accepting things that maybe 20 years ago weren't acceptable, because we're in the present day now and things change. You know what I mean? Things like LGBTQ rights, and they need to change. Society needs to become more inclusive. And so, it's sad to see this type of thing happening. One of the other comments, the reason I keep bringing up LGBTQs is one of the comments from the administration or folks in power, I forget who it was something like, these aren't students, these are just perverts, more or less. These are just a bunch of perverts going out there and slandering the state for no reason. And this is when, here, words like terrorists and things like that get thrown around way too often in a way that is really derogatory and negative towards the citizens of this country. And that's one thing that, in America, yeah, sure, there are some people on the right and conservatives who are pissed off now about the term traitor and terrorists and things like that being thrown around. But those words are sacred in the U.S. They're reserved for the really important issues. And storming the Capitol in the U.S. is a huge fucking issue. A different rector in a university is not the type of issue where if someone argues with you, you would deem them a fucking terrorist. That is horrific in my mind. So anyways, hopefully that paints a less foggy picture of what's going on for anybody who cared long enough to watch it for, 40 minutes. Sorry, long one. Anyways, I don't do political things very often, so hope this helps somebody. Enjoy.